Shadowgrounds. Circa, I don't really remember when this game came out. And apologies if the video stream looks a little weird. We'll get to that in a minute. I'm Aurian Archive. I am Aurian Archive, and this is Hybrid Theory. Grab your scuba gear, cuz we're going in deep on this one. And we're going in deep because of a couple streams now. I've basically just flipped on my phone, went to Google Chrome, and just read off the what I call Google approved news feed that sells me stories that Google intends to use to shape an opinion or to get people to think one way or another. And one of the stories that Google decided that I really should be interested in. Yeah, it's been a while since I've played this. Free camera mode. Okay, it's supposed to give me a free camera. How do I use it? Camera left. Alright. Alright. There we go. That should be okay. And reason kind of why I wanted to start with Shadowgrounds. Alright, the reason I wanted to start with Shadowgrounds is that this is often referred to as a twin stick shooter. This is the kind of game where you move your character one way, but you can shoot a completely different way. And we'll skip through this as quick as we can, now that I have something that I'm familiar or can use. And the reason why I'm starting with Shadowgrounds is that it is a very old game. But you can see, even on something this old and fair shot, I am actually running on my Ryzen 3200U laptop. Yes, replacing the fan seems to have resolved the issues from its sudden vertical descent. And so far, it's actually been working quite well, so we'll see how this goes. As we wait for the characters to finish talking, and then we can move on. And there's actually a spot somewhere here near the beginning of Shadowgrounds that is going to, I hope, demonstrate what I want to demonstrate. So bear with me as I play through the game. It shouldn't take too long. But developers and publishers from long ago loved twin stick shooters. They loved them because they didn't actually have to put a whole lot of work or art assets into them. And that's one of the reasons why Shadowgrounds stood apart from most of the other games. And that Shadowgrounds allowed the player, as you can see, to have a free camera. And it also did this. The shadow casting light, the relatively real-time shadows, the movement of objects, Shadowgrounds did this several years ago, and as you can see as I move the light around, we're picking up and you have loading zones that are outside of the player's point of view. zooming back so everything seems normal. Or does it? Now, do keep in mind, this is running on a laptop. This is actually running on a pretty, by current standards, underpowered laptop. This is only an 8-core Vega Vega GPU. But despite being only, what is it, 8 compute units? Give me a... Vega 3, 8 compute units. I want to go this way. That's what I'm looking for. There's the terminal. And fix the terminal. And then we had this. This again was unusual for twin stick shooters when this game came out. I would go so far to say it was highly abnormal. You did not expect first-person points of view. You didn't expect rotating cameras. You had very low expectations when it came to twin stick shooters. Most of the time, developers would use the fact that you had a fixed camera angle to make sure that they didn't ever actually have to do much work. Right. So now I'm in a room with a bunch of alien creatures. And seal them behind me and get out. Okay. And now, as you can see, we got a whole bunch of shadow things going on. We got a whole bunch of lights going everywhere. And as you can see, the targeting with, since I'm on keyboard and mouse, is actually pretty solid. And there we go, another down and low first-person point of view. Again, highly unusual for a twin-stick shooter. But if you've never really paid attention to twin-stick shooters, Shadowgrounds is probably worth looking up. Alright. And we'll actually let it finish loading. And at this point, we've pretty much seen all there really is to show with Shadowgrounds for where I'm at. We got cinematic camera angles, we got lots of light sources, we got rotating light, we've got facial animatronics, we got a lot of stuff going on. And again, this is pretty ancient hardware. So let's go to something that's a little more recent now. If I have to come back to this, let's see, resume. How do I say F5? Okay, options. Okay, it's giving me a. Anyway, okay, we'll quit, and now we'll focus on why I loaded up Shadowgrounds to begin with. The Ascent. Now, Ascent was one of those games that I personally hadn't really paid attention to. It wasn't on my radar at all. And then in the Google-approved propaganda feed, I saw a story that compared that compared the Ascent to Cyberpunk 2077. Now, I've actually played Cyberpunk 2077, and it's actually a really good game. It's not a twin stick shooter, it's not even an isometric shooter. And Cyberpunk 2077, it's more like, say, Grand Theft Auto, or Jack 2, or Watch Dogs, or any other insert open world game here. Now, right now, I am using an Xbox controller. And the reason I'm actually using an Xbox controller is that when I switch, is that there are no keyboard and mouse prompts for this game, or at least on the Xbox. You can use a keyboard and mouse, but the prompts do not change to match a keyboard and mouse. And again, this wasn't even on my radar, wasn't even looking at it. And then I saw something from Google that compared this game, a twin stick shooter, to Cyberpunk 2077. Two completely different games, two completely different ways of playing, two completely different everything. And okay, so I've got a word. And the comment that just kind of irked me the most, sorry, I'm so used to having more control over this, is that the city in the Ascent was cooler than the city in Cyberpunk 2077. I just kind of can just let that sink in for something. A theoretical gaming site who, for uh, one reason or another, decides to apparently, quite honestly, run a story that the Ascent City is cooler than a completely different game from in a completely different genre. I just, uh, I'm not even really sure where to start. I mean, I'm really not. Give me a minute while I focus on not dying. That would be good. And what that really put me down thinking about it is that I was just playing Shadowgrounds. I mean, literally on camera, just in front of you, playing Shadowgrounds. And as you saw for yourself, I had full control over the camera. I can move the camera anywhere I want. The camera from the perspective of the didn't hang on the perspective of the player. There was no place for the developers to put something that wasn't actually, in the game and in the game as it were. And here's the Ascent, which is also a twin stick shooter. But there is absolutely zero control over the camera, no control at all. You're pretty much stuck with whatever the developers decide to show you, at whatever perspective they decide to show you it at. So you have no idea if some of this geometry or detail is even there. I'm sorry, this is not visually impressive. This is visually unimpressive. Straight out, there is nothing going on here that hasn't already been done before and been done better. Okay, but why? does that annoy me? I mean, what's the big deal about it? And that's where it kind of got into casualized propaganda. Now, most American citizens, most living American citizens, have never legitimately been subjected to propaganda in such a way that it becomes overt propaganda, as in you can't help but notice it. In living memory would be the what was it? Not the Iraqi uh, prime minister, or uh, during one of the Middle Eastern operation for one of the uh, propaganda ministers for another country, went on radio and was making bald, claims like the army of the nation was marching down the streets of New York City. I just absolute absolute insanity. Couldn't help but laugh at the guy. But outside of that, the propaganda is normally a lot more subtle. It's not in your face. It's just casual wording. Here we go, did it again. Uh, it's casual wording, things that are repeated over and over that there is no context given to, or are self-contained euphemisms that hide a true intent, and that is casualized propaganda. Now, I'm going to go through then several cases of casualized propaganda as they currently do exist in real life, and we'll use the framework of talking about games as a way to hopefully make casualized propaganda more clear. And we're actually going to start with World War II and Tokyo Rose and her equivalent on the German radio networks. I'm not even going to pretend to remember what those were called. And we're going to start with a political statement. The political statement is fairly simple. Soldiers who actually fought in wars where the other side had a propaganda minister, where the opposite side had somebody who was dedicated to the cause of convincing the enemy to surrender, to give up, to stop fighting. Those soldiers who were taken prisoner and kept in camps. There generally can be said two different types of people came back from those wars, and one type of those people were the ones who said, this must never happen in my country. This must never happen in where I live. And on the other hand, you had people who came back from the war having been subjected to the propaganda, having been kept in prisoner of war camps, having been tormented and tortured by the enemy, who, when they came back, they had a very, very different viewpoint. Their viewpoint wasn't, this must never happen in my country. Their viewpoint was, if I play my cards right, I can be the one sipping brandy next time. You know, people like John McCain, Jeff Flake, John Bonner, Paul Ryan, people who sold themselves as Republicans, but when push came to shove, they didn't actually vote Republican, hold Republican line. They didn't actually believe what they said. They were just in it for personal power. And if you're, of a political bent and your dominant memory of a political party, if the people who didn't actually believe or vote for the party platform or the party ideals, the get along gang who, as long as they were in power, they didn't care what happened. What does that say about the rest of the people in the party? And that's the effect of casualized propaganda, in that it becomes very easy when you have high level people in a political party who obviously do not believe to adhere to or agree with the party platform who become the center of the political party. John McCain was the center of the Republican Party for many years. He could make or break any new people trying to get elected into the Republican Party. But John McCain was not a Republican. John McCain was a mass murdering war criminal. And every day, and I've said this on Twitter, I'll say it again live, every day Meghan McCain should be sending thank you letters to the U.S. military, to both the Army and Navy branches, thanking them for not properly prosecuting her father, thus giving her the chance to be alive. And if you're not familiar with what happened, John McCain, wet fired his fighter jet engines on an aircraft carrier, murdering hundreds of Navy personnel. A reckless action that, in most cases, would have led to either permanent confinement, life in prison, or some other. They, if McCain had been properly prosecuted, he would have never held political office. He never would have been allowed outside of jail to hold a political office. So just keep that in mind when you consider McCain doesn't have a legacy. All McCain has is a path of bloody bodies that he built his power on and then used that power as a sledgehammer. Okay? So let's go back to casualized propaganda. Casualized propaganda is the constant barrage of people who say, you can't talk bad about McCain, he's dead now. You can't talk bad about McCain, he's a war hero. You can't talk bad about McCain because. No, you need to stay with the fact. McCain is a mass murdering war criminal, not a hero. Period. Stop. No story. All right. Other ones, you can't say bad things about John Bonner. He was the Speaker of the House. He was a high level Republican operative. Yeah, he sold the party out for his own personal profit. You get to speak bad about him, period. Slag him off. He doesn't represent Republicans, period. Sorry, Rand, focus less on dying, focus more on weapon management. Okay. Let's check our map real quickly and our missions. All right. All right. Got to go to access. I need to go all the way back to do that one. Oh well, we'll get back to that one then. Okay, so uh, we'll see if we can work on any of these side missions. And anyways, while I'm thinking about it, in regard to the Ascent, there are some big problems with playing. Most twin stick shooters try to divide everything up by levels so that the player can always get or access the equipment they need to proceed across the world. The Ascent is presented more as an open world shooter, and because of that, there are no delineations or markers or anything that give the player an idea of whether or not they're moving into a high level or low level or equal level area. So it's real easy to get into a position where you get your butt kicked. Okay, back to casualized propaganda. Another example of casualized propaganda is the steady, persistent myth that only Africans were held as slaves in the United States. A there's this thing called slave rolls, uh, or rolls of names, or censuses uh, where the names of slaves and or their owners is relatively public information. You may have to go into a library and search through microfilm to find it, but the information is still largely available if it hasn't been purposely destroyed. Not sure what's in there yet, so not going to enter. We'll keep following the arrow. We're coming up. However, when you actually go through and look at these slave rolls, you might notice that there are a lot of Spanish, French, Grecian, Italian, Jewish, Norse, British, and distinctly non American names that show up on slave rolls. So, what happened? You know, where did all of these non Africans come from? Well, you need to know a little bit about British naval history here for a moment. The British and the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese were pretty big on impressed servitude. In order to get enough men to staff or sail a ship, the British were known to. Okay, I see a vendor. Please be a health vendor. Can I even get to it? Yes, I can. Can I get to it without dying? Oh, that's a completely different question. I'm probably about to go splat. Yep. And here again is a perfect case of, in regard to the ascent of the camera hiding things. Okay, so let's restart wherever we are. Okay, so we'll pause it while I dig down this for a moment. The British, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and other navies would often impress into service soldiers or sailors or whatever from other countries. The problem is, most of these nations quickly learned that impressed sailors didn't make the best sailors. They weren't there willingly. They were likely to slack off work. They were likely to do terrible jobs. And, if you had an impressed sailor who was on watch, they might, you know, conveniently completely miss to jetsam or floats them in the water, causing the ship to crash. It's unrecorded how many ships sank in the various conflict between the British, the Spanish, the French, and the Portuguese, simply due to impressed sailors deciding, screw it, I'd rather die now than continue to put up with this. You were more likely to lose impressed sailors diving over the ship in the middle of the night, grabbing a raft and taking off, taking one of the precious lifeboats. And if an impressed sailor was picked up by another ship, they'd have no problems giving your relative bearing, direction, and which port you were going to. So, what are you going to do with all those impressed sailors who aren't really that great and you have to keep a constant eye on? And it's not like you can put them in chains like it's commonly shown in various movies, because if you've ever actually been on a ship, there are ropes, rigging, sails, lots of different items like that all over the place on a wind powered vessel. Handcuffs, leg manacles, they're not, how can we put this, usable in an actual ship. You can throw slaves in the hold, but now you've got people who are taking up, or unless you're putting them there for ballast and only for ballast, they're contributing nothing to the running of your ship. And if you're running a pre-dreadnought sail-based ship, you're going to need if this is before steam power, you're going to need every single able body you can to at least do something. Okay? So a lot of, and this, keep in mind, this is why it was called the slave trade. Trade, emphasis on trade. Slaves, or indentured servants, or serfs, or other personnel or population would often be traded to whoever needed them. If you were a sailor in a ship and you could afford to hire a full crew of able-bodied sailors willing to work for money who wanted to get out on the sea, and you didn't have to take along any impressed sailors to make your next voyage, what are you going to do with all the people you just impressed? Oh, that's right. You're going to take them down to the uh, to a trader and say, I got, 20 people. I have no use for them. I don't need them. You got anything for them? And the trader goes, yeah, I got a plantation that needs some extra farmers for the upcoming crop season. I mean, think about it as a more person to person LinkedIn or Craigslist or what Angie's List, whatever, where you have a list where you go to somebody who knows that this plantation needs workers. I can ship your impressed sailors there. That at least gets them out of your hair, gets them doing something useful. And a lot of impressed sailors, they've picked up skills while sailing. They may not have been very good at it, but after like a season working a farm, most of those impressed sailors were more than happy when they were taken back to the trader to get back on a ship. Do say, yeah, we'll sail, we'll be happy to sail. Yeah, sure, yeah, we will go sail all day long. That's why it's called a slave trade, because it was trading not just one group for another. And that's why, as you look through the in the U.S., especially through the slave roll, through the names of people who were uh, kept as slaves or taken as slaves, why there's a whole bunch of other names. Okay, so how, getting back to casual propaganda, how do we get to the myth that only Africans were taken as slaves? It was only Africans working on cotton farms. That it was Africans were kept and not taught language and not taught math or not taught any skills other than here's a sickle, go cut that branch. That's why it's called casual propaganda. It's the repetition of a false statement said in a true manner that harkens back to something that did happen. And to understand that, we need to understand a little bit more about U.S. history. And there's a name you can look up here, Benedict Arnold. And there's another reference here, more modern, that you can also look up, the Remainers, the British Remainers. Pardon me for a second. The British Remainers very recently were the group of British population, parliament, politicians, and, well, let's face it, the Muslim jihadists there to commit war on British soil, who were very upset that England was going to declare its national sovereignty and withdraw from the European Union. The Remainers collectively became known as the Remoaners because all they did was moan and complain that they were being forced out of the EU. Yeah, national sovereignty and local governments are good things, not bad things. Handing your government practices off to somebody who has no cultural connection with you, whose only interest is letting jihadists pour into your borders, yeah, that's it. Cutting off from them, good idea. All right? That's fact. That's not fiction. Getting out of the EU is a very good thing right now. Okay? Going back to the first Remainers, the first people who complained about leaving an empire, a worldwide empire, were the American colonists who decided that they didn't want to leave English rule. They did not want to stop swearing fealty to the king and queen. They did not want to be an independent nation with their own laws and their own customs. You know what the political party was? They were the Democrats. Yeah, that's right. The Democrats. Go back and look up the names. All of the original Democrats in the Democrat Party were British Remainers, people who were still loyal to the crown, not people who had participated willingly in the civil. Sorry, in wow, we'll get to that in a minute. Not the people who had these weren't the people who had participated in the war to free themselves in the Revolutionary War. These were people who, like Benedict Arnold, decided that we're going to do everything we can to make sure that these colonies remain British colonies. That was the origins of the Democrat Party. They aren't who you think they are. The Democrat Party are the original Remainers, the original people who said we want to remain with that government that's literally an ocean away from us, has no idea what's going on, has no idea of the local consequences. It's one that is taxing us with no representation. We get no say in how much they tax us. We get no say in how our laws are structured. Yeah, we want to continue that. Got it? The Democrats are the bad guys. And this is going to be a reoccurring theme in casualized propaganda, and that the bad guys are going to sell themselves as not the bad guys. They're going to change language. They're going to conveniently omit and destroy historical evidence. But historical evidence can be remarkably hard to destroy. It really can. All right. So we're going all the way back, and we now understand there is a hard link, a hard party roll link. The people who registered as Democrats and where they stood politically in regard to the U.S. declaring independence from Britain, where they stood on the signing of the Declaration of Independence. They said it shouldn't have been signed. That's who the Democrats are. They are who we think they are. Okay? Flash forward to the Civil War. Now, we've been collectively taught that the Civil War was fought over slavery. Well, a slight problem, it wasn't. The Civil War was fought over the rights of the states. The states, the southern states, declared that they had rights that the federal government could not trot upon. And if southern states decided that they would, form their own nation to succeed from the Union. And the northern states were forced with no other choice but to fight the southern states over states' rights, to actually declare war and say, no, you cannot succeed from the Union. That, no, you don't get to declare these rights for yourselves. Well, who started the Civil War? I'll give you a hint. It starts with a D and ends with crap. Yep, that's right. It was the Democrats. Okay, why did the Democrats start the war? I mean, isn't states' rights, like a Republican thing? Well, keep in mind that the Republican Party started with Abraham Lincoln. That's where it's got its degeneration of it. And Abraham Lincoln was the president who did declare the Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War as a weapon. Keep that in mind. Freeing the slave was not part of the Civil War. It was used as a weapon in the Civil War. It was a weapon. Please understand that. Okay? Keeping in mind that the Civil War is where the Republican Party got its start from, it's worth noting that the ideologies of the party before the Civil War are largely buried. You really will have a hard time looking up information on the Tories, the Whigs, and the Democrats pre-Civil War, because a lot of that information is, if it's in a library, is a likely buried in microfilm. You're probably going to have to dig through old records, you'll probably go into the basement. You're going to have to do something outside of the ordinary in order to figure out what's going on with those pre-Civil War parties and where they actually stand ideologically, how they actually voted, what they actually stood for. And the reason that the Democrats started the Civil War is that they saw states' rights as an opportunity to garner more power. And again, this comes back to the Remainers, the people who didn't want to leave the British rule. A lot of those Democrats weren't Native Americans, and that they weren't born on U.S. soil. They were diplomats ambassadors, the children of people who had come over. They may have been born in America, but their families still had roots from the Spanish, from the French, from the English, from whatever other country. They didn't take part in the revolution. They just wanted personal power. They wanted to set themselves up as barons, as lords of the land, like they were familiar with, like their families were familiar with, and like they had been raised as. That they should be, if they were the governor, then they had all the power. They didn't have to go through a local Congress or a state Senate or answer to any higher authority. They were the governor. And it's that fight over states' rights of the Democrats declaring that they can do whatever they want without any oversight. That's the key part of the Civil War that's incredibly important. It was about states being able to declare independent fiat of any oversight, either internally or externally. And yeah, that's kind of, you might want to say, a bit of a big problem. I see a guy with a shield down there, I think. Not exactly sure I can deal with that yet. Okay, okay, I can. All right. So, casual life propaganda. While the embrace of the I guess that's a good way to put it. While the Democrat part of the Civil War has long since been tried to be erased by both the party and by textbooks that are actually used in schools, it's really hard to kind of get away from. Sorry, I'm trying to focus on not going kersplat. So at least the motion if you're watching this like on a background. All right. So the Democrat very big on causing the Civil War, very big on using slave labor. And that gets into the other factor here. Why Africans in particular represented or came to represent a huge portion of the slave base, and in order to describe what historically happened. Oh, that hurt. Somebody with a grenade launcher is always a problem. I think I got him with the barrel explosions. All right, now I know there were some health kits back that way because I can feel the controller rumbling, telling me that I'm low on health. There they are. Okay, so why did Africans make up such a huge percentage of the slave population? Well, they didn't. They never did. The slave population was always mixed at best, and it would not be unfair to say that Caucasian males made up the bulk of the slave population. Yeah, that's right. Old Whitey, they're the bulk of the slave population. They were the bulk of the people who were traded back and forth, not Africans. But to understand why that is, well, ambush. Okay, that went better than it could have. Okay, health kit. Yeah, that would be nice. Nothing like blowing up a terminal. Okay, I got a yellow marker indicating I am getting closer. That was a nice critical hit. And yeah, slowly getting better at aiming and shooting. Yeah, I'm kind of chasing that yellow triangle, or yeah, that's not a triangle. That's a four-corner diamond. All right, I'm gonna need some health soon. All right, and there we go. Down. Okay, pause it again. And to understand this, we have to understand several other casualized misconceptions about life in the pre-Civil War slave practicing United States. The first is that most slaves were educated. And you can ask this of almost any farmer today. Is it possible to run a farm, any farm, with no education? Can you do crops? Can you do anything on a farm without any kind of education? And most farmers will come back and tell you that no, you can't. In order to operate on a farm, generally speaking, you do need a certain level of education. You do need to be able to count, you do need to be able to write, you do need to be able to read. And the reason for this is if you're working on a farm, you need to understand bushels, you need to understand weight amounts, you need to be able to communicate how much weight an item is. And if all of the people working the farm have to depend on somebody else who is educated to do all of that for them, for somebody else to do all the weighing, for somebody else to write down how much was weighed, to write down, to calculate the costs, to give orders, what needs to be done today, what order does it need to be in. If you're relying on one person to do all of that for a group of people, you either have significant overhead, as in you are employing more people to work the farm than you actually need, or you just save costs and make sure that everyone who works the farm can understand what's going on. Yeah, that's right. Most of those slaves, they were taught to read and write. Okay, but I can hear people going now. But we know from people who went through the Underground Railroad, yes, you do. You do know people who lived under, check their ownership records, Democrats. Yeah, like I said, that's going to be a reoccurring theme here that every time there's a villain or somebody who is doing something obviously wrong, it's a Democrat. Or it's somebody pretending to be a Democrat who voted with Democrats. Okay? So once we've established that slaves weren't actually illiterate, okay, they may not have been able to graduate a high school class, they might have been able to pass an elementary school course, but they weren't uneducated. they weren't illiterate. They weren't unable to read or write. A good case in point that you can go to today is the Charleston slave market. And you might go, why would I want to go where they sold slaves? And then you go there and you find out, no, they didn't actually sell the slaves there. It's called a slave market because that's where the slaves went to do business on behalf of their owners. That's right. Charleston had an entire street that was dedicated nothing but to slaves who could read, write, and perform arithmetic, doing business on behalf of their owners. Kind of shoots down the whole slaves were illiterate thing, doesn't it? Well, lots of things shoot down the whole slaves are illiterate moment. The actual handwritten records from farms where slaves were writing down how many bushels of cotton they had. The orders taken by slaves who worked in foundries of how many ingots of iron they had to make. The orders taken down from slaves who worked in coal mines, how much coal they brought out at the end of the day. That slaves were not illiterate is not unknown. It's just casually propaganda. It's turned into casual propaganda that slaves were illiterate. They weren't. It's turned into casual propaganda that slaves were African American. By and large, they weren't. By and large, they were pretty much every other nation. And the reason for this is that most slaves came from captured ships or countries that were at war with each other. And I hate to break it to you, but there weren't a whole lot of European countries that were sending ships to the United States pre Civil War that were fighting wars on the continent of Africa. And there just weren't. You might like to think that there were, but as far as I know, there are no notable battles between the French and the British that were fought in any modern day African nation. Do you know of any? Because I sure don't. I don't know of the Spanish and Portuguese fighting on African soil. I don't know of the Chinese, the Hong Kong and Oriental traders who came around the Cape Horn. I don't know of any battles that they fought on the continent of Africa. Okay, so where did the African slaves come from? Oh, yeah, that's right. They came from African warlords who were fighting each other who sold their conquered subjects to British, Spanish, French, Greece, Italian, Egyptian, Chinese, what would eventually become known as the Polynesian Islands, I think, uh, American, South American. You had African warlords who were selling their own people to any ship that came to the Cape Horn. You think about that for a second. The vast majority of the Africans who were born in Africa or had their parents born in Africa who were in other nations as slaves, they were there because they were either captured and sold as a slave by their own people, or they were descended from people who were captured and sold as slaves by their own people. Yeah, you don't get to fault the American government for the African American slaves. You fault the African governments and whoever was in charge who actually sold the slaves to begin with, took the slaves captive to begin with. You don't fault the people who took them out of there. And you really can't. Because think about this for a second. If you are a British captain and you land at the Cape Horn and there is a slave trader there and they have 20 African slaves and they tell you either you buy these slaves from me or I kill them tomorrow, what do? You probably stand there in a daze and go, you know what? I have the money. I'm going to buy those slaves because I don't want you to kill them. And the slave trader goes like, good choice, man. Yeah, that's what went down. We know that. It's not. This is not conjecture. This is not a hypothesis. This is what the British documented to the king and queen of what they found in Africa. This is what the French documented to their kings and queens what they found in Africa. This is what the Spanish documented. This is what the Portuguese documented. This is what the Greek documented. This is what the Italians documented. Even the Chinese who had their own long strenuous history, who did send ships. They did send ships. The East Indies Trading Company did trade with China merchants. China had their own merchants going to England around the Cape Horn. Even the Chinese documented the brutality of the African traders who were going to kill their own people if they weren't bought. And when people called their bluff, they got to watch the next day as those traders in the morning either hung hundreds of slaves at once. Well, that was actually the most common way, was to hang them, because rifles were kind of expensive and ammo was kind of expensive to make and kind of hard to get. Uh, or they would stab them, behead. They would do something to kill mass people at once and go, well, you had the chance to buy them yesterday. They're useless to us now. Yeah, again, documented by multiple nations to their kings and queens. If you've ever wondered why the British went on their colonization, why they aggressively set foot in so many countries, it's because they were getting reports back about the brutalities of the local governments and their disrespect of the people. The British had a reason to go all imperialistic and literally take a law to lawless land because that's what they experienced, lawless lands. The African warlords were lawless. They either sold you or they killed you. There was no option C. Okay? So now we get to the point where we've got these Africans who have now been shipped to multiple nations. Well, what good are they? They came out of Africa. They're not really good farmers for any local crops. They're not really good sailors because they've only sailed once, and that was after, when they were probably malnourished from being held by a warlord. It's not like they were in the best shape to begin with. So they probably weren't all that great, and now they've been taken definitely to another country where what do you do with them? Well, if you are a business owner who needs inexpensive labor and you have simple jobs to do and you can afford to pay the trader who has brought these slaves in, you go, yeah, I'll take them off your hands. And you give them room and board, you give them something to do, you give them work, and you teach them a skill. But you're taking people who have had zero skills. They came from a country with zero industrialization. They came from a where am I going? Okay, there. They came from a world where they didn't have anything. All right, and it's telling me to do covers again. And I may need to do cover to get around these guys. Oh, rocket launcher. All right, there we go. Get that out. Sorry, didn't mean to blow you away. Well, technically I did, but okay, I am still following the yellow. Okay, so you are a businessman in the United States. You've had the slavers have dropped off this huge contingent of people who need a place to go. What are you going to do? Are you going to say no, I can't buy them, send them, put them back on the ship, and then they get taken to someplace else? No, you're probably going to go, I need them. I need labor right now. I'll take them off your hands. Okay? So what happens after it's established? Because these same ship captains who are sailing back and forth from the Cape Horn, from Africa, from the various ports in Africa, who are sailing from there to the United States, to Portugal, to other nations, to France, to Spain, to Germany. What happens when they go back to the Cape Horn and the same warlord sees that they've uh, shipped in? They don't have the captives from before. Where did they go? All the warlords have to do is ask, well, what did you do with the people we sold you? It's, can you use any more? I've got some more. You either buy them now or I killed them. Well, what happens when the captains just stop making port? What happens when they start going around it? What happens when they start porting elsewhere? Well, then you get what did happen. You have dedicated traders who stand up. They already know all the routes. You got uh, exos, the executive officers, the seconds, the whatever, however your navy was configured. You have mercantile vessels who, like, I can make a buck if I grab those captives there and sell them in another nation. And that's how we get to the Africans going everywhere in the world, along on sailing ships on dedicated slave trader ships. Because the first African warlords knew exactly what buttons to push that would infuriate those sailing under the flags of another nation's government. Nobody, no country liked the idea of mass murder. No country was going to be willing to support it. And that's what the African warlords were doing. All right. So where do the Democrats come in? Why do they? Why is it thanks to the Democrats that we go from the perception or the reality, if you will, that Africans kept as slaves are a distinct minority in the slave trade to a perceived there was nothing, all the slaves were only African descent? Well, the short answer again is who were the Democrats? And I don't mean that jokingly, I mean that as a serious question. Who were the Democrats? And it comes back to what was stated earlier. The Democrats were the sons, daughters, seconds, cousins, whatever, of former royals, former governors, former people. Sorry, I wasn't expecting an ambush, but I'm rapidly learning to always expect a firefight. Even if where that cursor says I'm aiming and where the bullets are landing aren't exactly the same thing. Okay, so let's just work this through logically. We know that the Democrats, by and large, are former royals, former people who have never really had to work in their life. They've now taken on, or someone has taken on their behalf, like whoever they appointed to make sure that enough labor was achieved to run the farm, or all of these other important questions about how do you do this, how do you do that. With all of that going on, where is this sending me? Down, I guess? Or up? Oh, mm, going all the way back this way. Okay. And keeping in mind, if you're a Democrat and you are all about personal power, you are all about everyone's there to serve you, everyone's there to do what you want. Yeah, going back to the Ascent, this game really needs like a pathing feature, like little lines dotted along the ground telling you where to go, because that vague arrow, vague diamond off in the distance ain't really that helpful. I'm not going to say it's terrible, but it is pretty bad. Pretty bad. Ecology, Warrens. Okay, it is sending me back down. Okay, so just bringing back the mental picture, you are all about power. You now have power over people. You now have a bunch of people who have been, for lack of a better word, dumped on your doorstep that you've now trained to work your farm. Or you have spent the time resources for them to work your farm if you're a plantation owner, or work your foundry, or something of that sort. What are you going to do when the off season comes? You can't keep, most of the people. you're not going to be able to keep because you don't have the resources to feed them, clothe them, or whatever. You need to send them. I mean, it's the off season on the plantation. Really, what are you going to do? Hmm, that's nice to know. Thank you. That's a lot of waste. I'm collecting 10 feral what? Another thing that this game could really use is a dash function. I mean, I'm sure there's probably a dash function somewhere, or at least you get one, or the ability to move faster. Yeah, feral testicle. Ew. One of those where I kind of had to ask, who in the world needs that? And then I remember, I don't really want to know. Okay. Oh, hey, a chest I didn't open. Anyway, so the uncomfortable answer is you build spot for them on your plantation. You build permanent housing. You find other things for them to do during the off season. You start up your own industry on the plantation. You start your own cotton weaving. You start your own textiles. You start your own foundry work. You find a reason to keep these people that you now have complete control over available. You make sure that they can't get away, that they can't go get a better job. And incidentally, this is also why the sub rules came about. Sub rule being that a slave counts, or slaves only count for, or the total population of slaves only counts for two-thirds the population of the state's population or the city's population. Partially, the reason why this logic went through was to give southern states that had large plantations greater uh, voting representation, while at the same time not absolutely, if you counted the entire population of the slaves kept on farms or kept in flight, to completely overwhelm other states without plantations, without such large human workforces. But there was another aspect to it too. The fact that many of these slaves, their employment was continuously in flux. That is to say, the slaves weren't at, give me while I try not to die. Anyways, this, if, let me put it this way, if 1/5 of your slave population during the harvest season gets, you take them back to the ports, you put them back on a ship, and then they sail for the next 6 months, and then they come back in 6 months, you don't have that population working for you 100% of the time. Now, you technically haven't taken those slaves off of your rolls, they're still on there, or at least they're still counted, but you don't want to be, have somebody actually saying, is Sir Francois Dubois of the French nationality still here? No, he's on a French ship right now. He'll be back next spring. You really don't want to say that to a census taker or somebody who's actually running numbers. What you really want to say is, some of my slaves are out in the field. I can't actually go get them right now. Can I just, give you an approximate number? And then the number counter, whoever it is, goes, sure, yeah, whatever. They're not paying me enough to care. It's one of the reasons why the sub numbers were given rise to. Not because there really were that many slaves, but because many of those slaves weren't to own a plantation or even available or part of the population, period, to be counted as a representative part or a representative aspect of population. A number of those slaves would go south and to do the harvesting, and then go back up north to various cities where it was more industrialized to work foundries or ironworks or coal mines or something like that. And then when harvest time came back around again, they'd go back south. Migratory slave populations. Again, not this can be checked where you have the same slave on roll in a South Carolina plantation and the same name appears in a foundry up in Pittsburgh because it's the same person. They're just being traded back and forth from an owner in the South, from a plantation owner who can use them for farming when it's harvest time, and a foundry who can really use them when it's not harvest time because they can work a forge, they can mine coal, they can do something that's useful. Again, slave trade. It's trading slaves back and forth to where they are useful, not buying slaves and then keeping them in chains until you break their bones. Kind of, important distinctions here. And they really do matter very much in a historical sense because they were how political policy was determined. The representation of the population of slaves was incredibly important and argued over tremendously according to numerous minutes of meetings held over the representation or lack thereof of slaves. Oh, that got me as well. Let's try not to let that happen again. How do I get down there? What is down there? Oh, a couple of basic components. Nice. Okay. So how do we get from point A to point B? How do we get from a transitory population that people or Democrats really want to hide the true number of to vast majority of slaves were African descent? And again, we have to step back and take a look at a larger picture of what is going on from a collective viewpoint. Other factors to keep in mind in the pre-Civil War era is that a number of other nations, Spain, France, Portugal, Greece, Italy, the at that time the it was fair to say that the Papal State, the Roman Catholics, were a separate uh, government unto themselves, would often have a separate diocese, which would have its own representation. All of these political and religious organizations tended to take an interest in their own citizens. If you were a French national and you were being kept as a slave and you had been taken captive due to being pressed into service, or you were on a mercantile ship and uh, a ship of the line took you down and sold you on a slave market to somebody who could actually, use you for the present time, your home nation might be a little interested in recovering you, in bringing you back home. And it was not uncommon for a French ambassador, if they were to learn of a fellow countryman who was being kept as a slave, to show up and say, okay, we really need you to let Francois Dubois go. He's a French national. I'm taking him home. And what are you going to do? Cause an international incident by saying, nope, I'm going to keep Francois Dubois here. There you go. Okay, fine. You can, nice having you, nice working with you. If you're ever back in the area, please stop by again. We'll have something for you to do. And almost every civilized, emphasis on civilized nation, had embassies that would do that. Almost every civilization nation at some point was taking an interest in getting their. And part of this is due to the ongoing wars. A point made by, I think, Shad of Shadiversity, may have been Dracofanel. I'm not sure I'm saying his name right either. But one of the points raised is that the conflicts in the pre-Civil War European nations, the emphasis on building new weaponry, on improving weaponry, on finding the best way to kill people, meant that there were severe population droughts. There were less and less people who were of age and of combat skill to prosecute a war initiated by the royal governments. Well, if you are prosecuting a war and you need to get personnel back, and you know that there are people that you can very easily go find, all you have to do is just cross an ocean and remove them from the slave trade. And that's all you have to do. Oh, what are you going to do? Oh, that's right. You're going to go demand your soldiers back. You're going to demand your fighting people back. And that's what happened. Pre Civil War, the other nations were very keen on repatriating those who had been sold in the slave trade, thus causing a slow but steady drain on the amount of non Africans that were in the slave trade, not just in the United States, but were still in slave trade in any other countries. And fighting wars is expensive. You need people who can fight. And chances are, if you were taking back Francois Dubois, you were probably also taking back Francois Dubois' wife, and probably also Francois Dubois' kids, who may have also been taken or sold as slaves. You're taking back repatriating the whole family. Okay? So why didn't this happen with Africans? Well, can anyone answer this question? When was the first African nation established that had an embassy and was recognized by other nations? Or in other words, when was Africa considered civilized enough to have diplomatic recognition by other countries? What African nation came first? And it's a serious question. Look it up. Because what you're going to find is that diplomatic recognition for African states came after British colonization, not before. It came after the American Civil War, not before. Yes, there were African nations prior to the American Civil War, but those African nations were at war with each other. Those African nations were aggressively capturing and selling the people they conquered to get them out of the country, or killing them so that they could never fight again. It's kind of disturbing when you think about it. The reason why the Africans became such a huge part of the slave system, there were no embassies to ask for them back. There was nobody to speak for the African people. Their own, the Africans themselves, the warlords, weren't going to take them back. If those captives that ever showed up again, they would likely have been executed on the spot because they were captured enemies of a conquered nation. Does it make sense now why it's so convenient to say that the African Americans of today were the only descendants of slaves? It's a whole bunch of factors coming together. It's the French who were helping the Americans succeed from British to begin with. It was the French Navy that held off the British Navy, allowing for some of the victories by the American Revolutionary Army. The French had no problems coming in and telling the Americans, "Hey, we need our people back. Would you mind handing them over?" The Spanish had no problems sending ambassadors in saying, okay, we need our people back, hand them over. All right, time to go back to Hans. All right, so I am here. Do I have all of the feral testicles? Wow, that's something I'm not sure I was ever going to say seriously on a live stream, ever. Okay, so now we have both our point of action. We have the decreasing non-African population. We have the increasing African population. We have political people or political entities who are trying to reestablish the dominions that their families expected and thus had a reason to keep slaves on a farm or on a plantation or in a foundry, even when they necessarily didn't need those people. We have the setup for what Abraham Lincoln did, and that is to wreck the Southern economy by declaring the slaves freed and declaring that all those who were part of the United States Union would not be able to prosecute a slave under the pre-existing laws concerning slaves, as well as this is a huge point that's missed in it. And the Emancipation Proclamation also gave slaves who were previously counted as only partial representation, full representation. Well, what does that do to congressional districts? What does that do to senatorial districts? That's a good question. The answer was pure chaos, and that was the point. The Confederacy was established and predicated on exact control of the slave population, which was now, legally speaking, in regard to the Union, completely out of control. That was massive upheaval. Again, that was the weaponization of the existence of slaves. It wasn't a war fought over slaves, it was weaponizing the existence of slaves and where they stood and how they were used against the people, the Democrats, who were using those slaves. Now, I do need to, real quickly, while I'm talking about this, address another myth that I've seen pop up, and that was that in the Confederacy, one of the presidential candidates broke with the party platform and declared he was going to prosecute the Civil War while the party platform was against it. No, 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 no. What has to be understood here is that the Democrat Party was always for the war. There was nobody in the Democrat Party that was against the Civil War. That is a definitive statement. Personal communications, letters, the votes themselves. The Democrat Party was in favor of succeeding from the Union. So what happened? Why was there a presidential platform for the Confederacy in which the Democrat Party said, oh, we don't want to prosecute the war? Now, let me give you a big hint here. Democrats lie all the time. They never stopped lying. It really is that simple. The Democrats lie even today about what their intentions are. And there's a reason why I'm going through this thing about slavery first. And I'm going to get and so now we kind of come to the casual point. Casualized propaganda. Have you ever heard the term incel? Well, if you haven't heard it, it stands for involuntary celibate. The Democrats use it as an insult against a population segment that opposes Democrat views. Now, the intent or the believed intent is that it's supposed to suggest that the Democrats' opponents are so ugly or so outrageous or so trashy that they can't get laid no matter what. They are involuntary celibate. You know what that image conjures to me, involuntary celibate? It conjures to me somebody who's been knocked over the head with a frying pan, knocked out unconscious, and while they were out cold, somebody strapped a chastity device on them. It doesn't matter if it's a chastity belt for a girl or a penis locker for a guy. It really doesn't. They've, you know, Another option, they've been castrated while they've been out. They can no longer procreate. Their next generation is no longer in their hands. Well, what do you call, what's another word for somebody who is taken prisoner, has their rights stripped from them, is unable to procreate, and is under the complete control of a different segment of a population? Oh, right. Slaves. Yeah. You know that whole bit I just did on slavery and how the Democrats rigged the slave system to increase their personal power, how they tried to build, using the slave system, their own empires that they no longer had? Yeah, the Democrats are still doing that today, 2021. We're not in the Civil War anymore, but that hasn't stopped the Democrats from being tyrants. I'm at a loss of words that are used in tyrants. The thing is, when anyone uses the term incel, they're not using it to insult the other population. What they're actually saying is that other population, the people that stand against us, we think they should be stripped of their rights, we think they should be kept as slaves, and we think they should do all of our labor for free. Because that's the image they have of slaves. And they use the term incel instead of saying slave because it's a euphemism. It comes across, you hear it and either you dismiss the person outright because once they use the term to refer to somebody else, you know that they're not serious. They really have no idea what they're talking about. They're probably just a blithering idiot. But that's just equally dangerous. You can dismiss what, if somebody says, well, because of the incels, you can immediately dismiss what they're saying because they obviously don't have a clue. But you can't dismiss the threat that they pose. They are admitting outright they want to take you as a slave. They want you to be in chains. They want you to not have any rights. They want you to be helpless against whatever they bring. That's what they want. And that's casualized propaganda. It's taking words, taking ideas, it's hiding bits of history, it's reframing bits of history, it's ignoring bits of history, it's ignoring the mass pop, it's ignoring that Africans weren't a large portion of the slave population by these census rolls. They were a very small minority. They just happened to be a large majority of the Democrat population, which was holding on to the slaves instead of putting them back into the trade, instead of letting them be migratory and move on to different jobs. It's you're here for the harvest season and then you go, off you go. Instead of being migratory, they held on to them. And then they try, and this is where we come back to the Underground Railroad. All of the slaves who weren't taught how to read, who weren't taught how to write, go check their owners. All of their owners, they may not have been registered Democrats, but they sure as hell voted as Democrat. They sure as hell voted for Democrats to take office. Democrats lie to you. They lie to you every day. They lie to you every moment. That's all they do. That's all they have done. From the very start of their existence as a political party within the United States, they have always been about sabotaging everyone else. They have always been about personal power. They have always been about taking everybody else under control. So keep that in mind. The next time that you pull up Google Chrome and you're scrolling through the news feed, keep an eye open for casualized propaganda. Words that don't make sense at first, or what I may pronounce this wrong, so forgive me, the etymology, the history of the word. What's the root meaning? What does the non-contracted version of this word convey? What mental image does it conjure? Once you start asking yourself those questions, once you start digging in deep, and once you start realizing that there is a repetitive pattern here of control, of dominance, of forcing others to submit, it becomes very, very easy to start picking out casualized propaganda. It becomes very easy to pick out when people are making comparisons of apples to oranges. I started out here talking about Shadowgrounds, which is a twin stick shooter, and how what I've just been playing on screen in front of you on and off as I try to focus on between not dying and making my point. Shadowgrounds has more in common visually, gameplay wise, performance wise, with Ascent than a completely different game. But if you read the reviews for Ascent, The commentary on Ascent is all about comparing it to something else that it cannot be compared to because it's not even the same. It's an apple to orange comparison. It's not an apples to apples comparison. Now, if you want to compare Ascent to Shadowgrounds, yeah, in some ways, Ascent is a massive step backward. No free camera control. The I don't know if the aiming is terrible because of the controller, or I'm just not used to using a controller for these kinds of games. I mean, I was doing pretty good with Shadowgrounds to start with, despite it running in a really weird aspect ratio for the screen and having a skewed perspective. As far as there's no way that I know to throw Shadowgrounds into a windowed mode, so it gets like you get like the 4:3 stretched across a 6:10:3 screen, and that does kind of throw aiming off. Ascent doesn't have that excuse. I mean, it's the Xbox controller is actually pretty good, but it's keeping in mind comparisons, what you're looking at, what things are being said, and then realizing that you're being fed an emotional story. You're being There are people who really hate Cyberpunk 2077 because it makes a deep emotional Christian point very late in the game, and only if you follow one of the paths where you're under a lake. It's a powerful moment where your protagonist act one of the potential characters. Did they ever go inside a church? Did they ever attend a service there? And the person comes back in this quiet voice, no, it was just always there. And that was kind of a massive point buried in all the hubbub in the rest of the game. And so quiet, so detached from the rest. I can't help but think that it was deliberate. That the Cyberpunk devs, CD Projekt Red, waited until that moment to land that bombshell. What had happened to this hit? What had happened to the city? What had made things go so wrong? And the answer was there was this Christian church. It had been buried, it had been forgotten. It was under a lake. But the person who had grown up there, the church had always been there, had always been a foundation. And now it wasn't. It had been buried. And along with it, the rest of civilization. Kind of scary when you think about it. That one quiet moment frames the whole rest of the game. And you've got to work to that moment. It doesn't pop up in a normal playthrough. You've got to work to have that bombshell dropped on your head. And I think that's why a lot of people hate Cyberpunk 2077. It's not because it was broken, not because it didn't handle well on various consoles, but because it dared to make sociological points, psychological points, economic points, ecological points, points of religion that most other games don't just shy away from. They dive away from in a full fury. And there's actually a good example here in the Ascent. And this is where I actually am going to give credit to the Ascent developers. I'm not sure if I can see it, but okay, lore. And let's go stack boss. All right, the first stack boss that you meet is a guy named Pone. Poon. Poone. And when you first are greeted with Poon, he's shouting in your ear as you're descending into the madness. You're nothing but another indent, or as the game openly says, you're nothing more than a slave to him. But when you actually go and meet Poon, your first actual encounter with him, it's after things have already gone haywire. And he goes from being this shouty voice in the back of your head to telling you exactly what's going on, what the stakes are, and freely admitting that, we've all got to hang together or we need the cooperation of the other stack bosses or everyone down here is going to die. He goes from being the typical boss to being someone who he's actually aware of the situation. He knows what's going on. He has the full picture and he knows he needs help from others. It's a massive turnaround, and I applaud the Ascent developers for having the guts to do that in the game. It would have been so easy to make Poon a one note hard ass who doesn't get it, and you have to work around him because that's how almost every other game would do it. I'm kind of a little surprised because of that that this game has even gotten any positive reviews from the ideological driven left propaganda because it's a distinctly un-leftist position to actually care about people and not want them to die, to actually care about we need help here. That's a distinctly unsocialist position. And this game puts it on display very early, very quickly. So I haven't really done any research into developers. I mean, you've literally been watching me come to terms with playing this game. Like I just got out a tutorial and kind of going the casual life propaganda of what I read on this game beforehand, before I'd even loaded it up. And the only reason I have it is because it's a Game Pass game. Because I'm already paying for Games Pass to buy an Xbox Series X. So I went ahead and downloaded and tried it. And this game wasn't even on my radar. It's not even in a genre I particularly care for. I really hate isometric games because I've been doing game development and game design long enough to understand that there probably is nothing drawn over there. It's just a blank wall that you can't see. That the developers are using the lack of what's there, which you can't see, to make everything that you can see run a little better. And sure, you get some nice shots like this, but take a look again at that lower left corner. It's just a blank fog down there. There's nothing actually down there. There's no detail. You can't swing the camera around to see that. It's just blank. Everything that you can't see, everything that you're not intended to see, isn't there. To make a game like Cyberpunk 2077, where the player can look at anything from any angle at any time, is massively more difficult, massively more complex. It's a completely different game. It's a completely different genre. Ignoring that and still trying to compare the two, that's casualized propaganda. That's taking familiar concepts, things that sound like they should be the same, but absolutely nothing in common, and saying, oh, but they're the same anyways. No, they're not. Words mean things. Communication means something. Communication is important. And once you start failing on basic communication, once you start hiding what you mean to say, once you start using euphemisms, are you really the good person? I, are you really? And it's one thing if you're like trying not to tell a kid that you were banging a mistress all night long instead of your wife. I mean, how are you going to explain that one? But when you're talking adult to adult, when you're having a serious conversation about the future of a country, when you're having a serious conversation about taxes, when you're having a serious conversation about the role of a federal government, when you're having serious conversations about the role of a state's government, playing games with words is not what you want to do. Because you know what happens when you start playing games with words and that? Well, what happened in France? What happened in Spain? What happened in Portugal? What happened in England? What happened in Russia? What's happening in China? What happened in Japan? What happened in every other country ever? Oh, that's right. The citizens rose up and revolted against the government that was playing games. And you know what? The governments have, with only one exception, a 100% loss record. And that one exception is China. Every other government, from Russian to Brazilian to Greece to French to Spanish to the British to the American government, every time somebody played games and riled up the population, sought and caused a conflict, they've lost, except in China. Now, why is that? Now, I know the answer. I'll give you a second or two. Pause the, if you're watching this on a replay, pause the video and wait for it. The answer is the Chinese government was willing to resort to force, overwhelming force, lethal force, like the African warlords before them, and completely slaughter the opposition straight out of the gate. There was no chance for a guerrilla warfare. The Uyghurs are still locked up in concentration camps. Chinese Christians are being disappeared in the middle of the night. Chinese pastors who use Bitcoin and other digital currencies have vanished. Some, at least two of them so far, their bodies have been found. Their heads haven't, but their bodies have been found. Thrown into garbage dumps. That's not going to end well. And that's just something to think about. The casualized propaganda, twisting of words and languages, hiding what is really meant, disguising the intent. These are all the hallmarks of socialists. People whose entire perspective is skewed by make the other guys pay. Make them all pay. It's not my fault. I didn't do it. Make them pay. Kind of scary. And again, once you start getting an eye for it, once you start realizing how words are being twisted, once you realize the history, where do these people come from? What is their family history? What is their generational history? It's very easy to see the patterns. And then it's very easy to think of solutions that don't involve a physical revolt. So keep that in mind. If you're an American citizen and you are eligible to vote in the 2022 elections, I don't care if you hate the Republican Party, they're not your enemy. They never have been. I'm not saying that all Republicans are good. As I started out very early on in this live stream, I directly called out a number of Republicans whose only purpose for being a Republican was to gain political power. They came back from wherever they were. They looked at what was going on and said, you know what, if I play my cards right, I can be the one sipping brandy and watching hot girls shake the booty for me in the privacy of my own office. I can be the one in power, and everyone else can just suffer. A lot of them succeeded. My strongest advice would be is to get in the face of the freshman congressman. Ask them where they stand on the issues that matter to you. Where do they stand on your taxes? Where do they stand on nuclear power and cheap, affordable, efficient energy? Where do they stand on hydrogen fuel cell cars that don't rely on toxic waste batteries? Where do they stand on issues that actually matter? Where do they stand on abortion? Do they stand for another generation coming along, or do they stand for slaughtering a generation? Where do they stand on the issues that matter to you? Where do they stand on adoption? Are they for, if you can't have the kid, are they for what they do you get a tax credit because you gave your kid up for adoption? I mean, that would, instead of aborting your kid, put your kid up for adoption and get paid to contribute to the growing population of the country. And that sounds like something that people should be getting behind. Where do your freshman congressmen stand on that? Where do your freshman congressmen stand on your right to defend yourself? Do they understand that AR-15 stand for Armor Light Model 15? Or are they playing word games and go, I stand for assault rifle? Okay, yeah, if you expect people to be able to learn LBGTQ+, then you can learn that AR stand for Armor Light. If you can't learn that, then you are the problem. It really is that simple. And if nothing else, this stream will be posted on YouTube. You can share it. Although I suspect that once anybody from YouTube sits through my intentionally overlong streams, they'll understand the content that is being talked about is not content that favors YouTube. And the algorithm can suppress me. The algorithm, I've been hand edited by Facebook, Twitter, and others before. Nothing new. I'm Aurian Archive, and I'll catch you later.